Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to the Word of the Day podcast, coming to you as always, pre-recorded from the RAV4 studios. My name is Jamie Silva, I am your host, and I'm absolutely jazzed to be here once again, pleasantly explaining another useful word to you all. Today's word is the adjective officious, and this word has one meaning that's actually super similar to the word solicitous, which we explored in episode 19, and which appears to have been more prevalent in years gone by, but I'd like to focus on a different meaning. This one refers to those who presume or exaggerate authority in order to boss people around. So, someone who is being officious, in this sense, might tell you, sorry, I'm supposed to make sure no one gets in the theater after the doors are shut. And even though the play has not yet begun and your seats are right by the door so you wouldn't disturb anyone, and you were only late because you were helping an old lady walk slowly across the street, sorry, no, rules are rules and you can't come in till the first intermission. The online version of officious goes as follows, quote, assertive of authority in an annoyingly domineering way, especially with regard to petty or trivial matters, unquote. And domineering, in case you're not familiar, means inclined to exercise arbitrary and overbearing control over others. Now, this sounds inherently annoying, actually, but I appreciate the official definition making that angle explicit. And really, I think this is one of the best official definitions I've ever featured. It hits the nail right on the head and helpfully includes a couple different key senses of officious. For example, the phrase assertive of authority indicates that whether or not the authority is legitimate, whether or not it was properly conferred on you, you're very protective of it. You proclaim it loudly and demand respect from everyone around, refusing to countenance even the smallest departures from the rules, whatever those might be. Second, the phrase annoyingly domineering is very descriptive, I think. It suggests a power-hungry attitude that is all the more distasteful because the power involved is so minor. It's very likely petty and trivial. A good friend of my family told us this saying long ago. I think she made it up, actually. That's perfectly suited to this concept and to the word officious. It goes, if you give a person a clipboard. I realize this isn't very self-explanatory, so let me explain. There's a classic children's story called If You Give a Mouse a Cookie, followed by the perhaps lesser-known sequels, If You Give a Moose a Muffin, If You Give a Pig a Pancake, If You Give a Dog a Donut, and like a dozen others. And the premise with each is that if you generously offer any of these animals something small, like a snack of some kind, they'll demand all these other things in succession, like with the mouse example. First, a glass of milk to go with the cookie, which is reasonable enough, and then a straw with which to drink the milk, a mirror to look in afterwards to make sure he doesn't have an embarrassing milk mustache, then scissors to give himself a haircut he didn't know he needed till he looked in the mirror, then a broom to sweep up the clipped hair on the floor, then, inspired by that, cleaning supplies to clean up the whole house, then a nap because he's so exhausted from all the cleaning, then a story to help him fall asleep, and on and on. It's sort of a slippery slope idea. Like, if you give them a little, they grow bold, they always want more, and they feel empowered to ask for it. Now, back to this phrase, if you give a person a clipboard. This follows the format of if you give a so-and-so a such and such, and it also retains the idea that if you do so, the story won't end there. There will be consequences. See, the idea is that if you give someone a clipboard, you're probably putting them in charge of a minor task, or telling them to oversee something. This places them ever so slightly above other people on the authority totem pole, and as a result, the clipboard holder might get all puffed up and excited about the small slice of authority that they now wield. And sadly, very often, they wield that authority in an officious, in an annoyingly domineering manner. Crucially, the person with the clipboard need not understand the reasons behind what is written on it, or what goals it is trying to accomplish. They probably didn't write the rules, don't report to the person who did, and they have very little interest in learning anything more than what is written on the paper. The only imperatives are to tick the boxes, enforce the rules no matter how trivial or silly they might be, and above all else, don't let anyone question your decisions or your authority. This is officiousness writ large. As we know, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and to this I would add that just a little power can still corrupt a whole lot. Now, this is not some sort of belligerent, nobody tells me what to do kind of rant. Obviously, there are many small but important rules, and sometimes their rationales aren't obvious to the layperson, but they have to be enforced anyway. Like, I understand that if the nice attendant lets me bring my ice cream bar into the museum, even though I am responsible and tidy and wouldn't drip any of my Neapolitan on the floor, if they let me do it, they'd have to let everyone do it. And of course, we can't have that now, can we? That said, I think all of us have come across people who fit this description, who seem a bit too pleased about enforcing minor rules that they can't or won't explain, who ride the wings of delegated power far up above the clouds, breathing deeply of the invigorating air of self-importance. And those people, once again, are being officious. Now, let's talk about a couple usage tips for officious. First, in many cases, as hinted at just now, the authority in question is delegated. It comes from someone else, higher up. But not always, though. I could, for example, be super officious about my coworkers not letting their paperwork and whatnot encroach on my desk space. No one disputes that I'm in charge of my desk. That's my domain, and I don't need permission from anyone to control it. But if I'm really persnickety about even the tiniest corners of documents leaking over the dividing line between our two desks, even for a few minutes, I think you could say I'm being officious about it. Second, I think someone enforcing legitimate and important rules might still come across as officious if they seem to be having too good a time doing it. On the flip side, even though a lot of officiousness is about your attitude, sometimes the policies you're being asked to enforce are so nitpicky and strict, it's tough to enforce them in the first place without at least appearing officious. Service workers who deal with customers a lot will frequently try to cope with this and avoid seeming officious by blaming someone higher up the chain for giving them all these dumb rules to enforce. For example, they might be like, "Look, I'm with you on this. I also think you ought to be allowed to ride the merry-go-round with your pet donkey. I'm sure he'd get a kick out of it, no pun intended. But, you know, those amusement park executives, ironically, they're no fun at all. And they say only people are allowed on the rides. So sorry." This leads me to my final usage observation, which is that although officious has a pretty negative connotation, theoretically the objectors, the people calling the clipboard holders officious, they could just be resisting the consistent enforcement of perfectly reasonable rules. It's a judgment call. But this doesn't change the fact that officious is definitely a pejorative. Okay, it's now time for some examples of how to use officious in ordinary conversation or writing. Example number 1. "No pie until you sweep the kitchen, Lenny," said Lenny's older brother officiously. "I'm babysitting, and I say so." I should note here, by the way, that occasionally kids are some of the most officious types you'll ever see, if like a parent puts one of them in charge while they're away. The buck doesn't stop with the child in charge. They typically neither make the rules nor have the final say on enforcing them, but the power of the babysitter can go all too easily to their heads, and not the smallest disobedience or irregularity will be tolerated. Alright, example number 2. Edna bustled about the reception area with an officious air, rearranging the chairs with great energy and precision, but no particular method. Example number 3. The gate agent's officious rejection of Tabitha's barely oversized luggage set her trip to Nova Scotia off on a sour note. Example number 4 comes from the book The Secret Adversary by the great British mystery author Agatha Christie. And this selection comes from a part where a man by the name of Tommy is trying to do some detective work by following someone through the streets of London. And as we dip in, he is contemplating how difficult this activity actually is. Quote, "Supposing, for instance, that the person followed should suddenly hail a taxi. In books, you simply leapt into another taxi, promised the driver a sovereign or its modern equivalent, and there you were. In actual fact, Tommy foresaw that it was extremely likely there would be no second taxi. Therefore, he would have to run. What happened in actual fact to a young man who ran incessantly and persistently through the London streets? In a main road, he might hope to create the illusion that he was merely running for a bus. But in these obscure aristocratic byways, he could not but feel that an officious policeman might stop him and demand an explanation." Unquote. I like this example because running fast through city streets is not against the law. But a policeman who's on the lookout for any potentially odd or suspicious behavior, no matter how minor, will probably get all officious about it anyway. Okay, that is it for the examples, and that is also it for this episode of the Word of the Day podcast. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in, and I'd also like to thank producer Pete for making sure the rest of the staff didn't leave the RAV4 studios for any reason without a written permission slip from Pete himself. It's just the rules around here, and we do like to see them followed, so nice job keeping the folks in line, Pete. Anyhow, we very much hope you enjoyed the show, and be sure to drop us a line at wotdpodcast@gmail.com if you ever want to ask a question, suggest a word, tell a story about an officious librarian and some overdue books. It's all fair game. For now, though, this is Jamie Silva saying so long from the RAV4 studios. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time. Pete, a quick word before you go, please. Yeah, okay, so you probably didn't have to actually tackle the assistant audio technician to keep him from leaving the studio. I think he just needed to get a drink of water. No, I know. Yes, he should have had a permission slip. That is what it says on your clipboard, but, now he's all upset. His thumb is sprained, so he can't turn the dials on the soundboard. It was overkill, Pete. Just a little too much. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but still.